the game that we will focus on. Of course, because it is one of the biggest games in the preliminaries. Alireza Firouzja against Magnus Carlsen. And David, we've said it so many times. This quite possibly could be a World Championship match in the future.
Yeah, and I think not even too far in the future. Alireza Firouzja, he's only 17, but he has showed he can hang with the big guys. He nearly managed to pit Magnus Carlsen to the post in Norway chess. He almost won Tata Steel Masters. Firouzja is on the rise. However, we do see that in their head-to-head in online speed chess, Magnus is ahead, 12 wins to Firouzja's 1. So Magnus Carlsen, he will be the favourite, despite the fact Firouzja is on the rise.
Wow. And it is Alireza Firouzja with the white pieces. Magnus Carlsen has said it himself. If there's anyone he thinks can take over his crown as world champion, it is Alireza Firouzja. Now, what do you expect from this game between them, Jovanka? We haven't seen... They played each other in the first tournament, Skilling Open, but we haven't seen Alireza Firouzja since then.
No, we haven't seen Alireza Firouzja, but they did play each other in Tata Steel, and in that game, Magnus won. He started off with a bang, and it was a very impressive game where he just threw all the pieces up in the air and absolutely came up with some innovative ideas to demolish Firouzja. So I'm expecting Firouzja to play solid. Do not take the game into an endgame. If there's something that we've seen that Magnus is perhaps slightly weak, if weak is the right word, in unclear, complex positions. Definitely nothing to do in an endgame.
Yep, he's just got to try and attack Magnus, use the kind of Dubov strategy. Daniel Dubov having beaten Magnus Carlsen on several occasions in the tour so far by just throwing everything at Magnus and attacking him. Magnus showing in those last two games already today that strategically he can create these kind of dominating positions, and Firouzja can't go for that. Meanwhile, okay, he has started Firouzja by playing with his queen's pawn. Will we see a transposition to the queen's gambit? Magnus, meanwhile, just pushing a pawn there. Very flexible from both sides. Firouzja now just deciding what to do. And okay, maybe not the most critical type of opening, just pushing a pawn there. I think this is something you've done on occasion, Jovanka.
Yes, very rarely when I've been playing my second game of the day, and I need to get my opponent out of theory. Occasionally I try out this very unambitious system just on the basis that, hey, I'm going to be playing my own kind of game. But we'll have to say something about like the Dubov approach where he just really goes for the jugular against Magnus. I think it's actually very, very difficult if you're kind of a classical player to suddenly switch approaches and just kind of play high-risk chess, because the thing is, you can do this high-risk stuff in a middle game, and it's not that risky. But if you do it straight from the opening, then you start burning the bridges very, very quickly, and it's almost like there's no going back. And I think Magnus... I don't think this opening that Firouzja played is particularly scary. And the problem is that these days it's becoming more and more popular that people have the tendency to kind of sit down and work out what they're going to do against it.
Yeah, so the reason we say that this type of opening is not so ambitious for White is because actually White's central pawns now, they block in White's dark squared bishop. So White's dark squared bishop there next to the queen, completely blocked in. Just doesn't have a great future, at least in the short term. That is why Firouzja pushes a pawn. He wants to develop his dark squared bishop to the longest possible diagonal. This system, it does have some hidden venom later on. Actually, earlier we saw the Ginger GM. We saw Simon Williams. And he's produced some content on this type of opening. He's found some great ideas in this opening. And he wins many games. Every time I face Simon Williams, he tries to utilise this opening with White against me. So there is some hidden venom later on in the game. White's initial moves are very simple, very easy and logical to play. That's probably why Firouzja is choosing it in a rapid game. In rapid chess, with only 15 minutes on the clock, you just want easy moves. They don't always have to be the best moves, but you want an easy plan while your opponent burns that time trying to figure out how to counter your plan. That's why I expect to see Firouzja now just castle the king, the white king, just tuck it away to safety, and then start developing pieces, and later on try and explode the centre when white is more ready than black. If we count the pieces that have been developed so far as well, white 3 pieces developed, black 2 pieces, it's only a tiny development edge, but it does amount to something a bit later on. I think Firouzja just going for that really kind of tense scenario, and as Jovanka says, building up before going for the jugular later. Firouzja, his instincts are very aggressive, very attacking, So if he gets the chance, he will try and attack Magnus. Not only did he lose actually in Tata Steel to Magnus, but he also lost in Norway chess to Magnus in an endgame. So he will not want to head for an endgame in this one.
Now, since we're talking about Firouzja as maybe the next world champion, and Magnus even saying it, does that mean that these two have sort of similar styles?
Not necessarily, but I think it's just the way they approach games against lower-rated players. They're both extremely ambitious, and they're always... they take risks in different ways. Magnus kind of tries to provoke the opponent. Firouzja likes to kind of gamble in these very tense positions. And but either way, they're always aiming for the maximum, always aiming for the win. And actually, during this last month, the break between the Opera Euro Rapid and the Magnus Invitational, the player I've faced most online is Firouzja. And he has destroyed me. I think we've played about 40 games, and I think he's won at least 28 of them. It's a big score. And yeah, I mean, every game I face him, he's always looking for the maximum. So even if it's a dead drawn position, he'll find a trick or he'll find a resource that it's hard to face against. And psychologically, I mean, for a 17-year-old, I don't think there's anyone who is just so strong. And I mean, he'll bounce back from a loss incredibly well, and he's always looking to learn from these top players. He's always challenging, Magnus online. I watch them playing each other on playing bullet chess at 4 a.m. in the morning. I see him playing Nakamura at blitz chess at 3 a.m. in the morning, and it's Firouzja. He loves chess, and I think that's what he has in common with Magnus.
That's a wonderful training, but at the same time, it does mess up absolutely everything in your life, right?
Isn't that what chess does, basically?
When you're 17, you can get away with it.
No, I mean, if you had to go to school the next day, you're in problems, or you have to work the next day. I mean, it's a different kind of mindset, I think, to be able to play until 3 or 4 in the morning. But having said that, Firouzja is a massive talent. But one thing I did notice is that when he was playing, this was more over the board, was that he did get nervous.
Yes.
And Magnus actually used that fact against him, and he managed to win a game just because Firouzja was visibly shaking at the board. And that's something that can be a problem.
Yeah.
You do not want to be playing fast chess and not be in control of your emotions.
Yeah, and I think that's just a generational thing as well. Firouzja, all of his training has pretty much taken place online. I mean, he learns purely by playing, pretty much, and learning by error. But Magnus, he grew up, I mean, same time as me. It was just when computers weren't super strong, so you learnt with books first, you learnt over the board. All of your games were over the board. And then Magnus was able to kind of profit from the knowledge of computers when he was a bit older, when he was a bit more experienced already. So very different kind of schools of chess in terms of their development. But I think in terms of approach, relatively similar. You're right, Jovanka, though. I mean, playing till 3 a.m. in the morning is not healthy. I don't recommend it to viewers at home.
And it just reminded me of a conversation that I think Joe Rogan was saying that, to be the best of everything, you have to have the mindset of a conqueror. But it just messes up absolutely everything else, your social life, your work life, but, it just have to be focused on chess. But, these guys do have the energy and the dedication to do that, and all credit to them. But while we're waiting for Firouzja to come up with a move, we do have to remind you all that we are having a quiz of the day. And because the theme of this tournament is space, we are asking, if you could only bring one person on a journey to outer space, who would it be and why? And you can tweet us using the hashtag #ChessChamps, and one lucky winner will win 1 year premium membership on Chess24. And we do have some answers that I'd like to read out. We have a Crusher C who says he'd take Daniel Dubov with him to space as his chess moves are out of this world. I think he's familiar with outer space. That really reminds me of the tune. I'm heading into space to find another. Right, yeah. Okay.
He's a space cowboy, Dubov.
Yeah, space cowboy. Yeah. And also Gunther Blauvens, he says he would take his grandson on that space journey so that he can experience the greatest wonder of his life. playing chess and understanding what space on a chessboard really means. Nice. I do like those puns on chess and space. Keep them coming. And remember, you can tweet your answer using the hashtag #ChessChamps. And you can also tweet us just to join in the fun, the conversation. Any questions you have about the games, you can also use that hashtag #ChessChamps to get in touch, and we will feature your tweets on the show.
Do you know what I think is amazing? I heard that there are more possible chess positions than there are stars in the universe.
Atoms in the universe.
Atoms in, that's insane. So basically what we're seeing on the screen here, a chessboard of 64 squares, is more complex and deeper than even the universe.
Yeah, that's, I mean, it's mind-boggling, right? I mean, it's just... it's just infinite, just the possibilities within 64 squares with only 32 pieces. Yeah, that's why we love it.
That is why we love it. It's just like this position that we're seeing right now. Guess what, Kaya? Never been seen before.
Wow. After 12 moves, it's crazy. It's completely crazy.
And we were talking about space, and meanwhile, Alireza Firouzja, he's trying to gain space on all sides of the board. Magnus right now has a really difficult question to answer. Only one set of pawns have been traded as well, remember. So incredibly tense, this situation. White has a nice knight in the centre of the board, in the middle of the board, controlling a lot of space. And with his last move, the Ginger GM, Simon Williams, he would be proud. He has trained Firouzja well, or inspired Firouzja for sure, because that last move, pushing that corner pawn, pushing Harry the H-pawn, means that Firouzja wants to go all-out attack. And if we bring up the analysis board, we can see why Magnus is hesitating, why he spent almost... he spent over 2.5 minutes on this move. Normally, Black just wants to castle the king, get this king to safety, the king looking super safe here. But with Firouzja's last move, it's just indicating it's just going to be carnage. He's going to go on the rampage. He's going to keep pushing this pawn forward and use the fact that his rook still remains on this corner square to open up a line towards Black's king. So Magnus Carlsen, unless he really wants to play with fire, unless he wants to call Firouzja's bluff, he will not castle his king now. But if you don't castle, then what else do? You don't really want to trade knights right now, because suddenly White gains even more space in the centre, this pawn controlling a lot of important squares, kicking away this knight as well. So for Magnus, there's no easy move, there's no easy solution to this position. Firouzja showing already that he's trying to play that uncompromising chess that we said would give him the best chance against Magnus.
Mm-hmm. We have mentioned that Magnus is looking very sharp today. Let's take this Black move first.
Yep, Magnus, I think he was just so intimidated by that potential pawn push by White that he's blocked that pawn. He's pushed his own corner pawn, but that means that if he does ever castle his king, the Black king feels less safe now that his pawns are further forward.
Yeah. Well, so Magnus is wearing his vest, snooker vest, Jovanka, looking very sharp. But actually, someone also noticed Alireza Firouzja's T-shirt, and it's actually saying non-conformist, meaning, being a little bit outside the box, thinking outside the box, basically, right?
Doesn't follow the rules.
Yeah. Do you think he's sending a message here?
Yeah, why not? I mean, I do. Why not? You're on the world stage. Why not have some fun with it? Send a message to your opponents. Not going to follow the rules. You want to win. And well. This is the kind of chess that I adored when I was 6 or 7 years old. And here we have it. We have opposite. Well, maybe not actually, because the White King has moved onto the left side of the board, what we call the queen side in chess. And will Magnus follow suit?
Yep.
It has to, right?
I mean, I expect Magnus Carlsen to do the same, to castle long, to castle to that queen side and copy Firouzja, because simply if Black's king castles on the other side to the right, on the king side, he will just get attacked. And I don't think Magnus Carlsen is in the mood to get attacked in this game, especially by a younger rival who has kind of shown his hand already, has shown his plans to attack. And there we see Magnus, copying Firouzja and also castling on that left flank. Both kings now I expect to see shuffle towards the corner. Normally, when you castle on the long side, you have to take another timeout. You have to take another move to push your king closer to the corner, because otherwise it's just too exposed. It's too close to the centre. And now it will become more about manoeuvring. So no direct attack now because the kings are on the same side, but still very tense with all the pieces on the board. Only one pawn trade so far.
Yeah, it's a complicated position. I mean, for someone, I find it quite interesting that you've kind of highlighted it's all about manoeuvring. So that means that all the action is going to take place with the pieces, not the pawns.
Yep.
And I think a lot of players are just often so focused on getting those pawn breaks, opening those lines. I'm talking about myself here. But that it's maybe quite a little bit difficult to adjust to the fact that you actually have to start improving your pieces. I mean, I'm looking at the white knight. The one that's a little bit behind, I would be looking at manoeuvring in that one to greener pastures.
Maybe you want to manoeuvre it here.
That was the square I had my eye on.
And yeah, if, for example, if black continues just putting the king in the corner, if white's knight jumps forward, suddenly the two knights are ganging up against a pawn, a very weak pawn actually, the base of black's pawn chain, which is only defended by the black queen, and suddenly white would have a great position. So I like this move as well, bringing your knight forward, but maybe then we would see Magnus Carlsen trade a set of pieces, and if you jump into the centre, maybe the black knight will also do the same, jumping into the centre, and this position very kind of tense. Again, both sides have very strong knights, and ideally you don't really want to trade off a bishop for a knight, because as soon as the position becomes open, bishops will start taking control.
Yeah.
I expect this position, it's roughly balanced, but yeah, it's all about pieces right now rather than pawns. If you look at the pawn structure, it's completely blocked. These pawns are blocking each other, these pawns are blocking each other. So it's about piece manoeuvres.
Yeah, exactly. And just to highlight, David nicely pointed out that moving that knight there were consequences. White abandoned the control of one square, which allowed the black knight to kind of jump in. So then that means, OK, maybe it's not the right time to move with a knight. Maybe you should just pick up a rook and just put it in the centre and just, again, pass the move to black and just kind of say, you come up with a plan now.
Yeah, when in doubt, especially in rapid chess, when you don't have too much time to think, you just have to take a step back and say, OK, I can't see anything immediate. There's no immediate threats, no immediate captures or checks. Let's just improve a piece. And white should just shuffle his rook to the centre. And at least if some action starts happening, his pieces will be more ready. I think that's a very logical move, Jovanka. OK, Firouzja, non-conformist. He does not conform to the norms and put his rook in the centre. He brings it up. He's going across the board. He's going to try and aim along these lines. That's such a cool move. We call this a rook lift, when the rooks, this very rarely happens when you bring it up the board and then shift it across. It has more scope that way. I like it.
Is it surprising, especially to see it against Magnus Carlsen? We know the Magnus effect players will... It's
surprising because, it's a bit out of the box thinking, I have to say. I really didn't expect it because... Yeah, the rook is lifting, but the rook is lifting where? Where's it going to go? Tell me. Obviously, there's going to be some preparations behind it. And I think it's a quite risky move, actually. Because if it goes wrong, what is that rook doing there on the edge, looking at its own pawn? It's not necessarily the move that I would prefer. I would prefer to move it to the centre, but that's a little bit more classical. There's a little bit more... dare I say it, boring.
But it's classical for a reason, Jovanka. That usually those types of moves that we're expecting to see, we're expected to see them for a reason, and that would have been very logical. Meanwhile, Magnus Carlsen making very quick decisions. He's trying to take advantage of the fact that Firouzja has put his rook on a bit of an odd square, and now he's starting those piece trades. He's hoping that when things open up, white's rook will be misplaced. That rook that we said was lifting up the board. And now Magnus is actually sacrificing a pawn as well, potentially. Actually, I'm not so sure. Maybe Firouzja can't grab a pawn right now. If we bring up the analysis board, we can see there's a lot of tension right now. Magnus just brought his knight into the centre. It's all about this square. Firouzja can capture in the centre after knight takes knight, pawn takes. Now it looks like a free pawn. I thought white could be greedy here, but suddenly after bishop takes, this queen is overworked. Black will play rook takes rook. After the queen takes, suddenly the queen is no longer defending this bishop in the centre, and black emerges with an extra piece. So a bit of a trick here, a bit of a trap by Magnus Carlsen. Firouzja, he won't fall into it. But the problem is, how do you deal with that? And instead, he decided to trade and bring his knight forward. This isn't ideal for white because he's had to trade off his light-squared bishop, which was kind of holding everything together. But at least the knight is trying to jump into very strong squares. So, the next few moves, I think, are going to be critical. Also, one thing I do notice is maybe this rook is going to swing across and start to indirectly attack the black queen.
Yes, but swings and roundabouts, because, you know, suddenly there were consequences to lifting that rook up, that there's no longer protecting its sibling, and suddenly black might be the one that takes control of the open line in the centre, so...
Yep, so black could be the first to occupy the open line, and suddenly black, at least his rook would be extremely well placed.
Right.
I expect that to happen, actually.
Yeah, and I'm also thinking we saw Magnus be so magnificent with the bishop pair. Do you let Magnus have something that is so dangerous, such as those two bishops?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point. Long term, if Magnus can kind of just stabilise the position, the fact that he has those bishops will become a factor, and the fact that we're heading closer and closer towards the endgame will become a factor. Well, all of those in Magnus's favour. But, yeah, there's still some tension, at least. Firouzja has his own ideas, and he's not been playing too slowly, which is, I think, one thing that a lot of Magnus's rivals do suffer from, that Magnus effect, when they just get a bit scared and they play a bit slowly because of that. But, yeah, Firouzja, he's not showing any nerves so far. This one definitely in the balance right now.
Only 17-year-old Alireza Firouzja. It's amazing that he is here battling with the best chess players in the world, being one of the best chess players in the world himself. Magnus Carlsen, he became world champion when he was 22, 23, right?
Yep.
Actually, on his birthday, turning 23.
23rd birthday.
Yeah, so Alireza Firouzja still has many years.
He's already number 13 in the world, and he's only 17. I mean, if he moves up just 10, 11 places in the next few years, then, yeah, he'll be right there, ready to challenge Magnus in the future. And, I mean, he's 17, and he's also been through so much. He's left his native country. He left his homeland, Iran. He moved to France, and he quit playing for Iran because he wasn't happy with some of the politics there, that he wasn't allowed to play against certain opponents. And, I mean, to make such a big life decision, to commit to chess so early and so young, I mean, that just shows he's dedicated.
Well, he has 5 years to become the youngest grandmaster, because Kasparov did it at 22. Sorry, grandmaster. Well, he's already there. World champion, of course,
5 years.
5 years.
OK, what's your bet? Do you think Alireza Firouzja is going to make it?
I recently wrote a newspaper column where I predicted he would be a world champion, but I'm not sure. I think maybe it might take him a bit longer to reach his full peak.
Yeah.
And it depends. Magnus, he's got a few years left in him, so it's not going to be easy.
Yeah, I think Magnus is going to stand in his way quite happily. So I don't think so.
No.
All right, well, the bar is, shifting a little bit towards Alireza with these last moves.
Yeah, and that is because Magnus Carlsen decided to sacrifice a pawn. He, rather controversially, has decided to give up his bishop pair and sacrifice a pawn just to get rid of the white knight. So black's last move was to capture that white knight. White can recapture now with his queen if he wants an endgame, or with his pawn. Personally, I would capture with the pawn here. I wouldn't even consider taking with the queen, because it's Magnus Carlsen, because you don't want an endgame, and because currently white's queen is perfectly centralised. Queens are best in the middle of the board. So right now, white is a pawn up. That is why the computer gives white a small advantage, but it's not a huge advantage right now, because despite the fact white is a pawn up on that C line, so the pawn that's just recaptured, those pawns are doubled, and potentially long-term they might drop off the board, they might become weak. So Magnus, clearly he had an idea in this position to justify his pawn sacrifice, but either way, black is solid and has some compensation for the pawn.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely think that black has enough compensation for the pawns. Like you said, those two doubled pawns there, you know, Beth Harmon of the Queen's Gambit hates them. And she hates them sometimes for good reason, because they can't move forward. And there you can see Magnus is doing what is really good strategy. He is controlling those pawns. And when you have weak pawns, they are targets, and you control targets by, first of all, you have to control them, you have to restrain them, you have to stop them moving forward. And then secondly, you start piling the pressure on them. And then thirdly, you munch them. And I don't even think he needs to try to win the pawn, actually. I think it's enough just to control it, just to make sure it doesn't move forward. And then with his active rook and the queen, he has enough compensation just to hold the balance.
Yep. Yeah, and if we bring up the analysis board, we can highlight that. I mean, the fact that these pawns are isolated, doubled, and very, very weak long-term. But you don't have to go and win them immediately. Right now, they are defended. That's why Magnus' last move, just bring the bishop back. That bishop was blocked, doing nothing. He's simply going to blockade those pawns. He's just going to plant his bishop on this square where it can never be challenged. For example, if white just makes a move, black's bishop will drop forward. These pawns now are it's as if they're not there. They're just completely blockaded. Black also attacking this pawn. And as Jovanka mentions, this rook is looking like it might jump into the game, might become very, very active. I really like Magnus's last move. I would expect to maybe see Firouzja try and trade off these rooks right now, because this is black's best piece, potentially, this rook on an open line. And you want to trade off your opponent's best pieces for sure in every position. So I would expect to see a rook trade and then maybe the position fizzle out into a very balanced endgame. But either way, Magnus, maybe not trying to win this game necessarily straight from the off, but playing more strategic here.
Yeah.
And Firouzja, if he overpresses, if he underestimates the strength of black's pieces, then it might backfire. But no, OK, Firouzja, he does not want the draw. He does not want to trade pieces. He moves his rook.
I'm not sure about that move. I really loved the move of putting the white rook opposite the black rook because, yes, Firouzja might trade, but Magnus doesn't actually want to trade because then he would correct the pawns, and you don't want to correct your opponent's double pawns. Here, I do feel that Firouzja is kind of gambling a little bit. He's kind of putting his pieces on not the best squares and just giving Magnus the opportunity to generate play. Yep. And we've seen Magnus be very, very dangerous there.
Yeah, exactly. And Magnus, he's currently in the type of mood where he just wants to stabilise. His last few moves with black, his next couple of moves, they'll just be about improving the pieces, controlling everything, and then he'll look for the kill. And we do see White's last move, bring the rook across. It looks like it's targeting a pawn, one of black's key pawns, but that pawn is simply defended by black's queen. So White's last move was kind of superfluous. It was just, there was no real point behind it. And suddenly, we do see Firouzja thinking again. It does show that maybe he lacked a kind of continuation. He lacked a plan over the next few moves. Magnus came up with this bishop maneuver. It was a deep plan, 2-3 moves long. Firouzja just came up with a one-move idea. And meanwhile, now he's had to retreat his queen. That's not a good sign. As soon as you start retreating, the opponent's pieces will start to step forward and jump forward. Queens, I did mention, they're best in the middle of the board. Now White's queen has been forced to put herself on a far worse square just to control the entry points for black's rook. And I think Magnus now, he's the one, he's still in the balance, but he's the one who might start to create threats. And I expect to see maybe he just step forward with his rook one square, just over-defend his pawns on the right side there. Magnus, he's got plenty of choice and he's got a minute extra on the clock. This one, could go either way at the moment. White's still a pawn up, though, and a pawn is a pawn. So something to look forward to for both sides.
Wow. All right. Well, you mentioned it, David. Alireza Firouzja leaving Iran. Sorry, I just had a caramel. It stuck. But Alireza Firouzja, he left Iran, so he's now playing under the FIDE flag.
That's right. Yes.
And he's playing from Paris, right? So should we expect him to sort of change federations quite soon to France?
Yeah, I did read an interview with him where he said he was, it was quite likely. I don't think he's committed yet. He hasn't promised anything, but it's quite likely he'll play for France. And then he and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, they will be tussling for that number one spot in France. That would make France an incredibly strong team. France, they're very passionate about their chess. Lately, they've so many new grandmasters in France. A lot of support for their players.
Well, we're talking about France being an amazingly strong team, but the big news actually is that Levon Aronian has actually transferred federations. He is now going to move to St. Louis and represent the USA. Yeah. Which would make the USA the strongest team.
That's an insane team. And actually, we're going to talk a lot about that tomorrow. We're going to hear Levon's thoughts and reasoning for switching nations. So it's going to be a big theme tomorrow. And we even have Levon playing Wesley So, I think. We have Wesley So and Hikaru Nakamura. I even think maybe we have Levon and Hikaru Nakamura. So it's going to be a lot about the American team tomorrow.
Yeah, there's a lot of rivalry there, but imagine if that team gels and at Olympiads, at these kind of international events, USA, they're going to be almost unstoppable.
Yeah.
Half a dozen players out there in the top 50, just out of the top 50 in the world. That's...
Yeah.
So
the thing is, though, if, like David says, if that team gels, if they kind of manage to work together, the team atmosphere is good, there you have a winning formula.
Yeah. Maybe if they're inspired by the Queen's Gambit, because that's when we see Beth Harmon excelling against the Russians, when the American team comes together.
Yes.
So that must be the dream now for the American team with all these super strong players.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And they've got some amazing players, I mean, who, if they managed to work together, would be absolutely... I mean, we're talking they could seriously challenge even like Magnus for the World Championship if they get motivated and they just get going. You know, just imagine what ideas they could bounce off each other. I mean, it'd be unbelievable.
Yeah, imagine if Fabiano now qualifies for the World Championship match in November, if he wins the candidates, if that American team can just come together behind Fabiano and help him against Magnus, that would be interesting.
So many young talented players in the US. I mean, having these idols, these role models now at the top of American chess, that will just surely inspire them to new heights. Exciting times for American chess.
Yes. Yep. And also for Alireza.
No, I was just going to say, it's quite funny though, because I do actually know one story of a team that won the European Team Championship. It was a little bit unexpectedly, and they were asked privately what was their success, what was the reason for it, and they said, we can't stand each other, we just don't talk.
Really?
I think I know which team, but I'm not sure I should say.
No, I'm not going to say it.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, sometimes, I mean, different things work for different people. Sometimes you need that hatred or that kind of energy just to push yourself. And team chess, it is individual games, so if everyone's on form at the same time, anything can happen. Meanwhile, Magnus has just been very solid over the last few moves, and Firouzja, he's been spending his time and he's committed to a very risky but also very instructive king maneuver. We do see, after White's last move, we have seen over the last few turns, Alireza Firouzja, he's brought his king up early in this game while the queens are still on the board. He's brought his king up, and the whole idea is to protect this doubled pawn, the front pawn of these two weak pawns that we mentioned a bit earlier. So Magnus does the same. He brings his king forward. This white king, it can't be targeted right now. We'll see why the computer jumped up in White's favour in a moment, but this white king cannot be targeted right now. You can also push a pawn forward, and as long as it hides on white squares, it cannot be targeted. It's got enough pawns around it, enough pawn shelter. I think the reason that the computer, the stockfish bar, jumped in White's favour there was because it liked the fact that White could maybe go into a queen endgame, and now by rerouting this bishop, trying to trade off even more pieces, try to trade off this bishop next, and if it's pure queen endgame, then maybe White's extra pawn will start to make itself felt. But, we do see the manoeuvring continue, and instead, Firouzja just brought his bishop forward, and wow, Magnus Carlsen, huge decision, shocking decision, surely.
Absolutely shocking, because now he just gives the opportunity for White to iron out the double pawns. So is there anything wrong with taking that rook with a pawn? No, and it's happened on the board. Okay, so his reasoning was that he just wanted to explode open the position where the white king is, just blast it open, and I don't know. It's a very high risk because, there aren't too many black pieces on the board. It's only a queen and a bishop, and they're not traditionally the best attacking duo, primarily because they don't really work well on both colour squares. They work well on, in this particular case, the dark squares. And highly, highly risky stuff from Magnus. I don't like it.
Yeah, so now, instead of a position where he was a pawn down, but the opponent had weak double pawns, now he's a pawn down, but the opponent's pawn's looking great. And it looks like the queens might come off the board as well. Currently, Magnus Carlsen's bishop is attacked, therefore he retreats it. The queens are looking at each other. Will we see a queen trade? Maybe that will be Magnus Carlsen's saving grace if he can get the queens off the board and blockade on the light squares. We do see bishops are both on dark squares right now, and the problem for White is that his bishop on the dark squares, it's just blocked in by all of his own pawns. All of White's pawns also on dark squares. So White's bishop, not a great piece right now. It means that he just has no influence over the light squares. And, if the queens come off, maybe Magnus will be able to hold a fortress. That is what he's been aiming for. I mentioned a shocking decision earlier, more in surprising, not necessarily a bad one. And it does look like Magnus, he's seen far enough into the future to justify his earlier decision. Look at all of Black's pawns. They're all on light squares. White's pawns, most of them are on dark squares, and that is why it should be a draw. It should be a fortress.
Yeah, it does look like a fortress, but still, Still, I think it's I'm not quite keen on the decision per se, just because it gives Firouzja hope.
Yep.
And it gives him a chance to also gives Magnus the chance to go wrong.
This is true.
And you kind of always want to kind of think about the odds when you're playing chess, especially rapid chess. You kind of, if you see a way how to draw and it's like 90% of chance of drawing, you should definitely go take that one rather than something that you see might be forcing 10 moves forcing and definitely leads to a draw, because you might have made a miscalculation.
Yeah, and this is one point where I would maybe disagree with the engine, the computer evaluation, because although it says 0.0, the computer thinks it's a dead draw. From a human point of view, only white can win. And there we see the bar does start to change its mind. This is the type of position where, at the very best, Magnus Carlsen will draw this game. Computers don't take into account the odds. They don't see that, OK, maybe it's 70% chance of a draw, but also 30% chance of a win. Especially, being a pawn down here for Magnus, the margin for error is far smaller for him. Firouzja, even if everything goes wrong and the queens come off, and even if he loses a pawn, it should still be a draw. So Firouzja is the only one who can win this game. And still, Magnus, he'll need to be accurate to hold this position. Maybe the good thing for him is that Firouzja is much lower on the clock with under 2 minutes.
And I just want to jump in and mention that I think we just set a record in the Meltwater Champions Chess Tour. Because Dubov and Nepomniachtchi just finished their game after 33 minutes. And I don't think we've had all games still going on after 30 minutes so far. Not to my recollection, at least. So definitely saying something about the tension in the tournament. It is a major 16 players. Half of them will stay home but be out of the tournament, Ivanka. So do you think that's why we're seeing that they're staying at the board? They're fighting in these games already?
Yeah, the thing is, though, this is kind of what you do on the first day. You kind of maybe play a little bit sensibly, cautiously, but at the same time, you still have to you're kind of like, you have to maneuver yourself into position. And you have to bear in mind when half of the field leave, well, you do have to score some wins and you do have to take the risks. And also, if we were to actually look at the 16 players that have been invited, well, these are actually fantastic attackers. Yeah. They're known for their dynamic, uncompromising play, and they have an array of achievements behind their belt. So I'm not surprised that the players are really going for it. This is what we wanted.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as soon as you mentioned that first result, Kaya, I noticed a couple of games immediately finished as well. So three games finished back-to-back there. Meanwhile, in this position, Firouzja, he's going for the win. He senses blood, and he's brought his queen. Look at that white queen, deep in Black's camp right now, eyeing up a pawn. Also, as well as the pawn attacked, the pawn next to that white queen, there are some big threats. White's queen is threatening to check the black king from behind, and that would be very awkward to deal with. So Firouzja, he's going for the win here. Magnus has to drop his queen back to try and hold the defence, to just try and hold all of his weaknesses. And I think that was the key move for Magnus. But he will be regretting not taking the chance to take those queens off the board a bit earlier on. I think that was the easier way to draw. But he let Firouzja keep the queens on a bit too long. And suddenly Magnus, he's back on the defensive. The problem is, as Ivanka mentioned, queen and bishop tend not to be a great attacking duo. And here, White's only attacking with the queen. And unless he can get some backup, it's impossible to win a game just with a queen. Magnus will keep threatening a queen trade and should be a draw.
Yeah, I agree. It's going to be very, very tricky. I do wonder if there's some kind of chances, because naturally I'm start looking at the forcing moves. And that wasn't a move I necessarily considered, but I was looking at the kind of moves that attack bishops, the checks. And now that Firouzja has stepped forward with his king, can Magnus get greedy and snatch a pawn?
I think he can. We will see Magnus right now debate whether to use his black bishop and capture White's pawn in the centre of the board. I think he can get away with it. It looks a bit scary, but if you can get the bishops off the board and if you can win your pawn back, suddenly, once the black queen gets active, it will be able to give perpetual check. OK, Magnus decides not to risk anything. Black bishop takes pawn there, I think was fine. But instead, Magnus goes for a check. He's just trying to kick the white king back, and then he'll retreat with his queen back to where it came from. And we might see a repetition of moves. So, yeah, Magnus may be missing a way to a forced draw there, but it's still under control for now.
But there's still maybe some nasty traps in the air, right? So, I mean, say the white king takes a step back. I think you have to move it directly backwards. I don't think you can move to the diagonal because you have to keep control of the queen giving checks. Okay, this is the move that I'm thinking about. And yeah, I was just going to say, I don't think that Magnus should be tempted to now capture the pawn because I think that would be a huge, huge mistake.
So, for example, if we... OK, we do see
we're
maybe...
going to see a repetition.
If Magnus Carlsen steps forward with his queen again, giving a check, that will be the second time we've seen that position. OK, Magnus does not repeat. So Magnus does not allow a threefold repetition, but he's on the defensive. I think he would have been happy with a draw, but maybe he was scared that Firouzja would not repeat the position and move his king to a different square. So instead, Magnus kind of preempts that. I think it's a bit of a psychological power play there. Magnus just wants to say, OK, I'm not scared. I don't want the draw. And Magnus just retreats his king. Firouzja, meanwhile, bringing his queen back. Look at those clock times as well. Firouzja with under 30 seconds. Could we see some nerves from the youngster? As we have in over-the-board tournaments between these guys, over-the-board clashes. Meanwhile, White has a big, big threat here. Black's bishop is pinned. It cannot move because White's queen would attack the black king. Therefore, White is threatening to just push a pawn, attacking that black bishop and winning that black bishop. So Magnus has to deal with that. How will he deal with it? He might give check with his queen. He might just move his king out of the way. There we go. He does move his king out of the way. And, OK, the ball is back in Firouzja's court. OK, he's brought his queen forward. And, OK, that's the third time we've seen this position. And the game is agreed a draw.
Wow.
So quick, so sudden.
Yes.
Firouzja, I thought he maybe could have tried to play for the win there. There was still some life left.
I was expecting
30 seconds left.
Some pawn advance. I mean, the thing is with the online chess is that you can accidentally repeat the position 3 times. And usually maybe your opponent doesn't actually pick up on the fact that you've actually gone into a repetition. But unfortunately with online chess, it's like, bing, game ended, and you're like, oh, whoops.
Well, who's the most happy and the most annoyed about this result? Seeing both sort of the tournament situation, but also how the game progressed.
Yeah, I think Magnus should be more relieved than Firouzja. Magnus was a pawn down, even in the final position. For most of the game, he was a pawn down, and he was on the defensive. But then the speed he logged off there from the video call it did look like he was a bit annoyed about his play. Firouzja, meanwhile, did have chances, but too low on the clock to fully utilise those. And just towards the end of the game, we did see a bit of a dance, a bit of back and forth with the two players. And in this position, White jumped forward with the queen, attacking this pawn and also threatening to get in behind Black's camp. And I think this is the key move that Magnus used to hold the draw. Magnus dropped his queen back, and this was where Firouzja decided there's just nothing to do. He couldn't find a way to break through. If he brings his queen across, Black's queen will block. If he brings his queen across, Black's queen will block, and any queen exchange will lead to a fortress position where it's just a dead draw. There's no way for either side to break through. And that is why we saw a repetition of moves. And I think Firouzja maybe didn't realise it was a repetition. He moved his king forward. This is the first time we see the position. We see a check. And this is the second time we see this position. And actually, after a different assortment of moves, we saw the position repeat itself for the third time, using different moves. But the game is declared drawn if the position is repeated for 3 times. It's all about the position, not the moves. And the game was a draw.